So we are going to react to Sargon of Akkad, who basically, when an African agrees with him, that's when suddenly Africans become geniuses. But when they disagree with him, they're kind of idiots. But so we'll get back to that. But one thing I want to talk about is that I will play only a piece of this video, then I'll play another video, then I will, at the end, play the full one.
So this is the funniest thing I've seen in a long time. Lewis Goodall, noted shitlib from the Newsagents podcast, was obviously on his radio show, and an African gentleman called in and was like, yeah, colonizing Africa would be a good thing because it's full of corrupt states with corrupt leaders.
So for those of you that don't know, this is because of the Venezuela thing where America is basically colonizing Venezuela. And of course, again, dictators are bad. That's like the obvious part of it. But again, we've seen in, with things like ISIS and stuff, that just because you remove someone bad doesn't mean something good is about to happen. As we've seen with Libya, of course, just because you remove someone who you perceive as bad doesn't mean that suddenly you're going to have the nicest world ever. But that's not the conversation here.
We're wasting our resources and keeping us poor. And Lewis is just like, that's not how it works. You're not meant to bring me up and ask for Western colonization.
So you've probably heard this saying before that the winners are the ones that write the history, right? And these people who write the history have put two alternative histories, both of them colonial in the way they talk about it. One is that Africa basically was tricked out of its resources, which is a fake history. Africa was not tricked out of its resources. What really happened was at some point, Africa started to stagnate because of slavery and stuff like that. And then the Europeans were moving further on and on because they were learning from people from around the world, and they started developing all kinds of technologies, most of them which started from some other part of the world. And then Africa was in no position to defend themselves. The second one that's put out there is that Africa just had no great civilization and everything started going good when the Europeans started coming, which is a false one, which is why I'm going to react to a different video before we finish this one.
So I thought we'd just listen to it and have a laugh at Lewis's expense. And this is what I love about this, right? This whole thing is predicated on the libtard assumption that just everyone's the same, but also everyone believes the lie that everyone's the same.
Okay, so first of all, racism is the one that believes that everybody is the same. That's the point of it, that Europeans are all the same in a positive way and that Africans are all the same in a negative way. So this idea that liberalism is not true. It is true that a lot of liberals do stereotype as well and start to look at something that they call the, I guess I'll use the word divine savage or whatever, where they try to baby other groups. But this is neither here nor there. This is still Western colonization, Western imperialist thinking.
And that nothing the West has ever done has ever been good. It's all been negative. And the people who were on the receiving end of it didn't see any benefits whatsoever.
So obviously some good things happened as a result of Europe coming to Africa, but not because of the colonization. The colonization itself had purely negative stuff. And we will talk about this when we get into the deeper video. I wish it was a little faster getting to his point, though.
That's not true.
Anyway, Sam is in Acton. Let's talk to him first. Sam, your views on Trump and Venezuela?
Many are claiming that Trump is recolonizing Venezuela. If recolonization by Trump means peace, stability, and prosperity, so be it.
So, I actually quite like Africans because they, I don't want a billion of them here, obviously.
To be good faith, I'm going to let this one slide because he said I don't want billions of them here. So I'm not going to go and say he says he likes Africans, just make sure they're nowhere near him. But I'm going to let that slide and say he just meant he doesn't want billions of them there, because there's plenty to criticize in this video. We don't need to look at every little thing. And to address what that guy said, obviously, that is called the defeatist mentality. So corruption is so bad in certain places in the world that they will take any type of change, any, even, and I've heard this in South Africa where they literally say, some black people say this, we were living better under apartheid and blah, 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 and all this stupid stuff. And the reason why they say it is because sometimes they're tired of the government. Of course, if apartheid was about to come back, they would run away because they realized their life was going to be hell like it used to be. This is just called defeatist mentality. And again, it's not something that's just said by Africans. And again, it's true with the Venezuelans as well.
But like, whenever you speak to an African, they don't speak in Western terms. They speak in kind of old world terms, like saying things like, you know, if this means peace, prosperity, so be it. Like that's quite an old world way of speaking. And they,
To be fair, the guy talking sounds like he's old as well. And yes, there is a lot of those people from the olden days who are, I mean, I have to say the word, sellouts, who basically they love the idea of colonization because they made the most amount of money at that time while everybody else was suffering.
they tend not to guard their language or sugarcoat what they're saying either. So they'll just tell you to your face the thing that the truth of the thing.
So obviously you will notice a slight contrast in how he usually talks about Africans, but all of a sudden now Africans are the most truthful people on the planet. That's interesting.
Even if, like, that doesn't sound very politically correct. And that's, I do enjoy watching Africans addressing liberals.
Would like Trump, in fact, to extend his hand.
Just a quick thing on that as well. It is actually wild how impoverished Venezuela is, right? It's a country that has been endowed with unbelievable luck in the geographic lottery of the time and place they're in, right? It just so happens the world currently uses oil, and it just so happens that Venezuela has the world's largest reserves of oil, and you'd think the Venezuelans would be the richest country in the world then. You'd be like,
Yeah, you would think so, wouldn't you? It's almost like there's something standing between them and that wealth.
okay, we're going to be like the Saudis. We'll be the Saudis of South America. We're just going to just flush the world's oil market with our oil.
Well, if they did that, then Maduro would still be in power, and he'd be allowed to keep torturing and putting an end to people's lives, as some of the Saudi Arabians have done over the years, and have great support in America.
And everything would be great. But instead, Maduro has shrunk the economy of Venezuela by 80% and reduced oil output by 75%. As I understand it, because essentially of government corruption and cronyism, the state took over the oil, put loyalists in charge rather than experts in charge, and now just doesn't drill nearly as much oil as they used to. So it's like, okay, sorry, why are we doing this, bros? Like, is this socialism? Is this what socialism is? Literally, I mean, they were literally starving. And so this African guy's like, yeah, that doesn't sound good. It's like, good point. Yeah, that's a great point.
So obviously I agree that they should have probably put more experts in there, dug the oil, sold it. I get that, you know, a lot of people are against oil because of global warming and stuff, but I'll be honest, for some of these other countries, who cares? Like, if America and China and all these countries aren't going to stop, who cares? Just dig and sell it.
Why wouldn't you want, well, I mean, like, you can have freedom, you can have political freedom, aside from the fact that no one can be governed by socialists, but also, why wouldn't you want your oil to be produced properly? Like, you would want to actually do something with the 300 billion barrels of oil that you have access to, wouldn't you? I would.
It. I would like Trump, in fact, to extend his hands and go to my native Africa. Many of the countries in Africa are today failed states.
So, of course, we've all seen videos of Africa, and Africa is not necessarily filled with failed states, even though most of them are just rising states. In other words, they're not at the best that they could be, but they're not these failed states, as he puts it. But I will also say that, again, this comes from a defeatist mentality by a people who, you know, are suspicious. A lot of these people are very suspicious, where they say nothing but good things about the Europeans and nothing but bad things about Africa. And you can see here that he's saying basically that Donald Trump should go colonize Africa.
They are sinking under the mountain of corruption and population explosion. This is causing a crisis that is driving millions to come abroad to look for a better life.
So, of course, Sagan looks very happy by what this guy is saying, which is weird. He's saying there's corruption and there's all of that, which, by the way, exists in a lot of countries. But yes, Africa has got a high level of corruption in a lot of places. And sure, you want something to be done, but not colonization.
We need to be recolonized.
Of course, Sam.
We need to be recolonized. He puts the blame on the reason Africans are leaving Africa down to African corruption. Now, as you can
So, for those of you that don't know, there's no such thing as African corruption. There's corruption. All corruption is the same. And in fact, it has the exact same motive, which is money. I mean, you call it money, but really it's trying to live the best life you can possibly live while giving them the least.
tell Lewis is already like, Jesus, this guy's gone way off script. Way off script. We can't have this. Bro. I need to remind you that we are in fact all the same, and Africa doesn't have a problem with corruption. You don't need to be recolonized, and in fact, everyone's the same, and it's really the West's fault that Africa's corrupt and is full of failing states, right?
So he's saying this sarcastically, but actually he is absolutely correct. Now, I want to play a video before we finish this one that will prove this. Although, I will say, and this is my thing, I have to put this out there, that I will disagree with this woman who is coming up next on the last part where she talks, because again, she falls for the other, I call it leftist propaganda in Africa, where they try to make it seem like Africans were stupid, even though we had markets way before Europeans ever got there or Arabs ever got there. And so we fully understood money and stuff like that. But she's going to make the claim that we did not have money. Instead, we bartered, which is not true. Bartering was a thing, but money was introduced a long time ago. So today we're going to react to a video that's talking about the African Golden Age. The African Golden Age is a time in West Africa where things started going really well for the population. Now, it's called the Golden Age because it's the height of what would happen in West Africa. But obviously, there's a problem with this name because, of course, there are several Golden Ages that we could talk about. One of them, of course, being Nubia, which its Golden Age would have been probably when they colonized Egypt. We could also talk about the ancient Egyptians themselves and how well their civilization was and how they basically created the Golden Age that lasted thousands of years. We could also talk about the Zagwe dynasty, which gave us great architecture like that of the Church of Lalibela and the several different rock hews that existed in this area. An amazing civilization in its own way. So if you're wondering what this is an image of an African man who is bringing a giraffe or walking with a giraffe. And this is one of those mosaics from Israel. So having said all of that, let's get into the video.
Thank you. I know that it is possible to look at the way that someone like Mansa Musa drew undue attention to himself when he went on pilgrimage to Mecca, and the amount of gold that he spent there and in other places like Egypt on his way to and from Mecca. And some people might look at this and say, maybe if he had not done so, Africa might not have attracted undue attention to its wealth.
So obviously what they're talking about here when they're talking about Mansa Musa drawing attention to Africa is the fact that Europe, which was already in trouble, drew up something called the Catalan Atlas, in which they showed several African civilizations. most of them foreign and strange, and even though they were rumored to have wealth, no true evidence had ever reached Europe the way they think. It only came when Mansa Musa had spread to Arabia and credible reports were sent to Europe, and even the people of Europe decided like, okay, so we might have something to go and check down there. And in fact, the Europeans on the Catlin Atlas show ships moving south in the western part of Africa, almost to see this exploration. So this ship of the Europeans that's trying to go around West Africa, you can see there with the black tents as well, next to the black tents. No doubt, no doubt, the European exploration period that came down through Africa, through this coast of Africa, which had never really been done before, came from the Mansa Musa tales, which, if they had heard of his tales, one of the things that was important about his story is the exploration of the Atlantic Ocean. And this is probably what led to them wanting also to go through that ocean as well. Whoever told these artists and writers about this person, there's no way they would have left that part out. And even in the writing, which we'll visit some other time, even in the writing, we can see indications of this.
However, that position is rather simplistic. The truth of the matter is that countries in Europe were desperate. It was a case of find resources to pillage elsewhere or perish.
So, of course, it is true that Europe at this time was suffering many different angles, diseases, all of that at the same time. And so, finding some other place where they could offload, I guess, or basically get a second chance would have been very attractive to them, especially when they consider the fact that through maps like these, one of them is the map of Roger, of course, which led to this map. These types of maps show like, okay, so this is where all the Muslims are, and they're basically blocking us off. The only path that we can see here is going around Africa, and we know that there must be some groups that are not necessarily hostile to us that we could do something with. And this is obvious in the early people who come through, people like Vasco da Gama and people like that who end up in Congo, Diego Chao, all these people. The whole thing is trying to avoid the Muslims, Find Prester John. That's another one, another person who brought attention to Africa, Prester John.
The 14th century was a period of major famines and crises in the agricultural sector in Europe. From about 1320, there was a famine every 10 years.
This period of Europe is called the Century of Crisis, and it's actually one of the worst of their times. Now, of course, she's going to go into it, so I don't need to go further into the deepness of the conversation.
Fields used for grazing and planting were affected by serious climatic changes, and so yielded very little, and soon they became abandoned. Food became scarce, and then epidemics such as black plague, typhoid, dysentery, smallpox, etc., hit populations periodically between 1313 and 1348.
Now, the interesting part is, while all of this was happening in Europe, Africa was having basically the best time ever. As I mentioned, there are many golden ages or golden periods, golden areas, which you can pick. I mean, some of them are literally aligned with gold. Remember, they said that about Great Zimbabwe as well. It said that there was gold on the borders of the houses, which probably was removed by the people who came to steal. But even with that, we know that Africa in general at this time was at the height of their civilization, which is about from the 1300s all the way to the 50. Well, it's from the 1100s to about the 1500s.
There was therefore an increase in mortality and a drop in birth rates. Citizens grappled with very poor standards of living, with with limited nutrition and several health problems.
Of course, you can imagine as well that this already Christian area would be far more Christian by this time, suffering all of this and possibly even thinking that it is something that they did to deserve this type of situation. And so they get more and more religious. And there actually are writings that there were some few areas that were pagan at this time in Europe. And basically, stuff like this led them to deeply go into those areas and stamp that out.
So these conditions in Europe were to have dire effects on the rest of the world, especially continents like Asia and Africa, which had and still have rich resources.
To be fair, the consequences also spread as far as America as well. And we all know this.
So most monarchs in Europe who had been looking for sources of wealth invested more in mercenaries who have now become canonized, in history as explorers.
So if you ever read some of the books by the early travelers who went around, people like Columbus, people like Vasco da Gama, you do not get this impression that these are like super elite people who are just like, oh, let's explore and see what's on the other side of the world. Wouldn't it be great? Instead, some of these boats were filled with freed criminals who were promised freedom if they traveled abroad. I mean, in the case of Vasco da Gama, this is exactly what happened. Some of the people on the boat were literally criminals who agreed to go on the trip around Africa. And because they were criminals, they did what criminals do, which is to try and commit mutiny on the boat. And they succeeded for a while, and then obviously they got captured and hot oil was put on them and stuff like that. So yes, the people who now we're taught like, oh, they were great explorers, they were just exploring and they had no intention of colonization and all this other stuff, that part is not true. A lot of these people were brutal from the start and they had very foul intentions. The term for these people in the Portuguese world were called degradados, and these degradados who would go with the other people in order to travel the world, they brought a level of brutality with them that was crazy. So let's read. Degradados were exiled convicts, particularly from Portugal between the 15th and 18th century, who were banished to colonies like Brazil or Angola as a form of penal transportation, serving crucial, often harsh roles in establishing settlements and trade networks for the Portuguese Empire. These decreed ones were used to learn indigenous languages, build infrastructure, and act as agents, significantly shaping early colonial societies and economies despite their criminal origins, though they were also a source of social friction. Now, I want you to keep that in mind as we talk about this, because that's one part that a lot of people don't think about when they think about the history of Europe. They just think, oh, yeah, it was just nice people. And it's like, can you imagine? Can you imagine if we took some of our criminals from any prison, pick one in any part of the world right now, and we sent them first anywhere? Imagine if we found like a second Earth and we send them there and we say, take care of these people for us, settle this area. You're free now. It's like, there's gonna be a lot of brutality coming with that. A lot of grapes coming with that. These people are criminals.
These mercenaries were prepared to risk their lives looking for wealth in these two continents as well as in the New World.
It is quite the weird deal to take criminals, send them overseas, and leave them in front of a whole bunch of wealth and say, okay, have at it. I mean, in that way, you can see why things would be as brutal as they are.
So, with the wealth they found and bestowed on their monarchs, these mercenaries then bought respectability. So, also based on the information provided by these mercenaries when they visited these continents, these so-called explorers, other people from Europe then started exploring and migrating to colonize other continents in order to find the wealth with which they then improved life in their own home countries.
Even the Spanish themselves had some pretty shady characters like Hernan Cortez, who started off as a normal person, and his crew was also normal. They were not criminals that were running around looking for an opportunity, but they eventually became that because they disobeyed orders and started going without permission, effectively creating a mutiny as well.
One thing which I find very disturbing and which we should all pay attention to is that as I continue to research this period in history, the irony of how migration has become so highly criminalized and politicized, so much so that a man like Donald Trump got elected based on a half-brained plan to stem immigration is just very puzzling.
Okay, wait, so I'm trying to understand what she's saying. So is she saying that the Europeans came with a very violent and opportunistic way of traveling around, but yet they still claim that they did nothing wrong in their history, of course? And so because they came through this violently with the intention of being violent by sending criminals to basically find places and take over places like Angola, like Brazil, like other places, I mean, India, things like that. Is she saying that this is funny when considering the fact that Africans who try to go to Europe are just going there to get a job, and they're looking at that as an invasion? But when we look the other way, they look at people trying to find employment as an invasion, but they try to look at people who are trying to invade as explorers. These explorers, the age of exploration, the people who went around the world trying to see if they could find opportunities far and wide and discover lands. When in real life, they sent a bunch of criminals to go and do some madness to normal people. And then they have the nerve to say, well, we just gave you Christianity, so, high five. You could even say when Europe was sending its people, they were not sending their best. They're sending people with a lot of problems, and they were sending peoples with a lot of problems to us. They were bringing drugs, they were bringing crime, and they were bringing rapists. And some, I assume, must have been good people.
We now have a situation in which, first, although there is lip service paid to giving preference to migrants who are war refugees, others who embark on migration as a result of economic hardship are criminalized if they don't end up dying during the perilous journeys or practically ending up enslaved.
All because, of course, of Mansa Musa letting them know that our continent was a beautiful continent. And then they decided to bring their worst men so that they can turn it into the worst place, waiting slowly. You saw there was like Angola and those places. They chose very specific places that were weak, and then they struck. But in later times, they would go for the neck of Africa once Africa itself was colonizable. But before that, they couldn't do nothing.
Now, this irony is driven home when one realizes that migration is a natural part of human life. Europeans, during periods in their history when life was unsustainable on that continent, saw the need to and were able to migrate in order to improve their circumstances.
Not only is migration natural, but it's actually necessary in its history in finding some of the best civilizations ever. If you take just the mainstream idea of North Africa, migration plays a huge role in why it becomes one of the greatest areas in history. If you take the Middle East, you take the areas which they call the Indo-European areas, if you take the Sumerians who came before any of those people, if you take Indian culture, if you take Russia, Japan, Europe, there is none of them that would become great without migration. So it's not that migration is natural, it's good.
So, while I'm not advocating that Africans and people from other continents should be given free reign in the developed world and that everybody should just they should just open their borders and let everybody in so that they don't become overwhelmed, I believe attempts to stem the current tide of migration must prioritize the rights of human beings, to economic survival and free movement.
Yeah, but for that to happen, they would have to look at us as equal. And I don't know if that's going to happen necessarily, because there's some people now. That's why they're calling it an invasion.
Why is there such little effort to address the huge and widening economic gaps between countries? How do we justify a world in which cats and dogs in some parts of the world are better fed than human children in other parts of the same world?
Well, it's practically unjustifiable, but they can justify it very easily. They actually like cats and dogs. By the way, for those of you that don't live in Africa, you probably don't know this. I don't know if it's irony, but if you don't know this thing where European powers will come to Africa and start talking about extinct animals. Meanwhile, there's like starving Africans sitting right over there and near the area, or war is going on or whatever, and they're more concerned with this animal. Like, oh, this animal's gonna go extinct, which by the way, a lot of the time it's like their fault that it's going extinct. They brought guns and they started shooting them. And then, of course, it's we should do everything in our power to make sure these animals don't go extinct. It's It's like, what about the poverty? What about that?
Why are we so reluctant to link the fact that young men and women will risk drowning in desperate bids to migrate to lack of economic equity, social justice, lack of job opportunities, and other factors?
So when I'm done with this video, I'm going to watch another video by Sargon of Akkad where he's going to make a claim that Africa should have continued to be colonized, which is ridiculous.
We must link these factors. Anyway, going back to the decline of Africa's golden age, as a result of continued contact with the Arabs and later Europeans, Africa witnessed fundamental changes.
So this is why I put this in the beginning. She's mainly talking about West Africa, and it's not necessarily with the contact of Arabs, although there is this contact with Arabs that, again, migration helps this. It's not really migration, but that did give an extra boost to an already thriving civilization in that area. And so there was this trade that happened within those areas, and we know it. We don't need to go through it anymore. And basically we saw some of the greatest civilizations that had already existed prior to the Arabs showing up and were already at its height, but they knew, like, okay, trade is good, let's go get more stuff. And of course they traded with the southern Bantu people. People don't talk about that at all.
Foreign trade partners worked persistently to establish themselves by developing relationships with the ruling hierarchies in Africa.
So let's introduce a new word. The word Jula, Julla, or Djyula, means the merchant class of the empire, and it was considered the backbone of the economic systems within the Songhai Empire. Now, this position is something that already existed as far back as the Ghana Empire and things like that. And the reason why it got transferred is because it had always existed. These people controlled gold, salt, and other important assets that traveled from one part or the other inside of the kingdoms. And they created unions, early unions, so that they could work. And some people look at this as like the earliest form of socialism within Africa, but we don't need to go into deep conspiracy.
Mostly, they did this by fueling and exploiting ethnic and religious divisions. Old rivalries and hostilities were inflamed or revived. As such, state structures were gradually destroyed by the violence in the form of skirmishes, ambushes, kidnappings. These all kept flaring up, leading to insecurity and fear. The ruling classes quickly saw that there was profit to be made from selling slaves, to their foreign allies.
Again, she's jumping timeline here, so you must remember what's happening.
Initially, the trade in slaves was dominated by Arabs, but Europeans swooned in. The ruling classes got so befuddled by either the newfound religions of their foreign allies or the equally intoxicating guns and sometimes real alcohol, which they got in exchange for their fellow Africans.
So, of course, there's a reason why I mentioned the merchants earlier. And the reason why I mentioned it is because there's this conspiracy, and she's kind of putting it out there as well, that Africans were sold for like nothing, for like trinkets or something, which we have to keep in mind. These people, these Africans that were being sold by other Africans, people always talk about that, There were criminals, and there were people who were war captives from another. So they were going to be a burden on the society. And then they were sold off, but they were not sold for nothing. They were sold for a lot. And obviously, that does include trade goods.
Their victims were mostly captured during wars, or sometimes simply classified as criminals with often trumped up charges.
So I have read for you guys before, and I should probably link it, the court systems that existed in these West African kingdoms, that they had like a supreme court, they had a court below that, and all of these of course involved money, so you couldn't just go in there and start claiming like whatever, but you could get your charges dropped, you could dispute your charges, you could do all kinds of things. So the idea that criminals in West Africa would just, people who someone accuses someone and then they get, now obviously we know criminal systems are not perfect, so not everybody who got captured was necessarily a real criminal, but yes, there were people who had fake charges put on them and then they'd be shipped over and sold to Europeans or Arabs.
Wherever the ruling classes got into partnerships with foreign exploiters, traditional laws and customs broke down, and the abuse of power became the order of the day.
So one of the things that actually started happening is because there was so much money to be made. A lot of people say there was nothing to be made, but because there was so much money to be made, criminals, and the Kingdom of Congo is one of those that writes about this in a letter perfectly. Criminals started making a lot of money by selling stolen slaves. So in other words, you go and steal people who are free and you just go and toss them with anybody else and go, take him, he's a slave. And basically the Europeans, they didn't care. In fact, in some cases, they wanted the person to be of a higher class. I don't know why, some sadistic stuff. But obviously, when the Congolese, because they were in alliance with some Europeans, complained about this, luckily, the Portuguese agreed and brought them back and punished the people who had taken those type of slaves.
In a few cases, the economy might seem to boom temporarily, but generally, the economy stagnated, and then human resources were wasted as the foreign invaders kept extracting resources, to take to their countries.
Okay, so I guess right now we're out of the golden age of Africa, and she's talking about when things started to decline at this point, because things did start to decline heavily because of slavery. That's one of the reasons, but obviously because of wanting colonization, closing certain areas, but we'll get back to that.
Beings were carted away to work and develop other economies, just as minerals and other natural resources were carried away.
So I want to be very careful here because we have actual documents by Alfred Dapper and other Europeans who talk about the type of stuff that was sold in West Africa to the Europeans, and not all of them were natural resources. I think that is a conflation of the modern day, but a lot of the stuff were finished products that were sold. I mean, I've shown you the rhino horns or the ivory that was carved in Africa and sold as a product to Europe, which, by the way, by simply carving these things on this ivory, they would make the ivory so much more expensive. And they liked the authenticity of it, the fact that it was carved in Africa, which of course creates a rare product and creates an expensive product. These were very expensive in Europe. In fact, the only people who could afford them were the extremely wealthy. And I mean, even till the modern day, some of these were still being traded. I mean, they still are, but they were still being traded for a lot of money. These African ivories, which had a lot of different names, but they were one of the biggest products that proved that it wasn't just some failure thing. Raffia cloths and also things like palm oil and stuff like that was sold over there. So this idea that non-processed natural resources was all that was selling to the people is not true. Now, obviously, gold, salt, all of those things were the dominating things, natural resources, but still, there was still a market for other things. And we must not forget that, because if we do, then we play the game of thinking that Africa was this place where it was purely extraction. And the extraction did happen more and more as we get closer to our modern day, leading Africa to become weaker while basically funding Europe.
The ruling classes of Africa were so debauched by their alliance with their foreign exploiters that they did not even see that they were selling their people and resources for Dodd.
So over here, what you're going to hear is what I call Western propaganda that made its way to Africa. As I mentioned, some Africans do believe in Western propaganda. And this last part is going to be just that. And I will show proof that it is that type of propaganda. Now, your guys probably didn't hear what she said. You probably heard Dodd, but she didn't say that. She said the Africans were basically selling slaves for dirt. Now, I will prove to you very easily that they did not sell their people for dirt. And not only that, there's a currency issue that's going to happen right now where she thinks that, and this is basically Western propaganda, that the Europeans and Arabs basically tricked the people. But let's wait for her to say it. This, again, is just Western propaganda, which has made its way to Africa, which is why I'm going to have to react to another video.
The currencies that were introduced, that first the Arabs replaced trade by barter for actual goods, which was the way in which Africa used to trade. So the Arabs replaced the trade by barter for actual goods with cowrie shells and other worthless shells.
So in order to talk about this, let's first start with the shell part. We're going to get back to the trading and bartering, but we start here. So in the Kingdom of Congo, which is unrelated to Arabs, in other words, had nothing to do with Arabs, no contact with Arabs whatsoever. It had contact with West Africa, but only in a sense of trade. So as we read here, from the shells of the oysters, when burnt, good lime is made for building material, and from the bark of the tree called mangi, which resembles cork skins of oxen, are tanned and made into soles of shoes. In short, the island produces no corn or vines, but provisions are brought from the parts round about and given in exchange for these lumache. Now, these lumache are the cowrie shells. For although in other parts barter is with metals, so as you can see there, in some parts of Africa, barter is made with metals, and in the other parts of the world, here it is with only in the Kingdom of Congo, but in Ethiopia, Africa, and in China, and in some parts of India. And this is where it gets funny, because they're saying they're useless shells. Well, China, with paper money, was using cowrie shells as a form of currency. Ethiopia was using cowrie shells and also metal. Obviously, Africa, as he mentions over there, which he doesn't mean the entire continent, but he means a specific place of Africa, they also were using that. But as he points out in the next sentence, it's usually a mixed economy. Money is used of a different kind of gold, silver, or copper, or of a mixture of these. For in Ethiopia, pepper is the currency. In Timbuktu, which is near the river Niger, called Senegal, they use cockle. And in the Kingdom of Bengal, of Bengal, which is in India, pigs, and metals together form the currency. In China, certain shellfish, also called porcelet, and in other places, paper stamped with the king's seal and the bark from the mulberry tree take the form of money, so that metal is not the standard for obtaining the value of merchandise in every part of the world, as it is in Europe and in some other parts. So you can see here that even though metal, silver, copper, all of these, which by the way also existed in West Africa for trade, this is something that is well known. These shells were also used, and instead of the lie that is Western lies, which she's repeating, and I don't blame her because she probably just studied it from one source. This is why you have to get things from multiple sources. She probably got it from one source. What basically they're saying is, oh yeah, what happened was they basically tricked them. They took cowrie shells, gave it to them, and went and started laughing like, yeah, take these useless shells while we take your resources, which doesn't even make sense because that will work the first day. If that was like a trick, that will work the first day. What's gonna make them come back? They'll be like, okay, these guys want to trade us for shells, and we're not stupid. These shells are useless. So here's a mix of the currencies of China that existed at the exact same time. And you saw there it was written. So you have the sealed paper money, you have metal coins, and then you have the cowrie shells. All three of these are respected money.
The Europeans then topped this by introducing other currencies like the manila and other valueless currencies.
You can see here in the representation of the manila, you can see them lined up here, that this was not a European scam, as she says. Obviously, these were produced in Europe and they were basically trading currency for slaves. Now, some people go, oh, in other words, they took this for slaves. No, they didn't. They didn't take this for slaves. The Europeans would take these two when purchasing stuff from the people in Africa. And so these weren't just useless, scammy stuff. These were things that were used to buy and sell goods, trade within the continent, which is where a lot of Europeans were posted up. Where they became useless was when the Europeans came and basically, well, the British came and basically considered them valueless. In other words, they did not want to accept it as currency, which basically you might as well have become poor in a day after that. Except, of course, Africa had its gold and other resources. So, since they talked specifically about West Africa, then let's read that part. The revenues of the king consist especially in the yearly tributes paid him by the dukes of Bemba, Bata, Sunda, Nambanganga, Bumbi, Masulo, Ondo, Angango, and other under the titles of earldoms, as of Pemba, Pango, and many others, which fall out of the St. James his day, when the king rewards them with some small trifle as a mark of his favor. Some have no doubted to aver that the whole income of the king amounts not to above 120 French crowns, besides some small presents made by every lord above his tribute, the greatest whereof rises but to the couple of goats, the most onely giving fruits as becovens wines, nuts, and oil of palm, They have no coined money, either gold, silver, or copper, but as we have often mentioned, make all their markets with little shells called simbos, which pass here as currency, but in the other countries of no esteem or value, and the Portuguese use them in their passage. So in Monemuji, we can see that also they have gold, they have all of these things, but they choose to use a different type of thing, but we shall read it. They use also for ornaments, chains or bracelets or chemical stones, which glister like glass and are brought from Cambay. These beads serve them also instead of money, gold being of no value with them. The king holds an immaculable correspondence with Kilwa, Malindi, Mombasa, by which means silks, cotton stuffs, the aforesaid beads of Cambay, and many other commodities are brought into the country and bartered for gold, silver, copper, and ivory. So again, gold in all of these places is so common. In Congo, it was common. Well, really, in Congo, gold was common, but also other metals which they wanted to mine. Monemuji, very common. In other places of Africa, as we're going to read one more, is also very common. And so to them, this is a useless product, but it's like if you give it to the Europeans, they're going to give you stuff that we desire. So this is the kingdom of Mali in the Negro lands. All the women except the slavers go with their heads and faces covered. They have no stamped coin, but plain pieces, yet bigger and lesser, all of pure gold. So here you have in Mali or Mali, their currency is all gold. If you it's nothing but gold. And then it says, this king or emperor of Tambut, ruling vast dominions that yield him inexhaustible treasures, which he piles up in bars or billets of pure gold, some of them weighing, if the reports be true, 1,300 pounds in weight. So again, we have to say this is if the reports be true, which again is being reported at a different time than when Mansa Musa was alive. This is way after Mansa Musa. They're reporting the gold of Mali. The number that is given to us is 87,466,660.10 worth of gold. And as we read earlier, this is only some of which that he piles. So these piles amount to this much each pile. So it's easy to assume that he had billions and billions of dollars.
So, as far as Africa is concerned, neither the Muslim Arabs nor the European Christians ever had any intention or interest that was not self-serving in Africa.
While it's absolutely true that the Europeans had self-serving interests, obviously there were some of them who did not have self-serving interests. But to say that the Arabs had self-serving interests from the get-go and that was just it is that's not true at all. A lot of the Arabs, basically all they did was pass the religion by and then leave. But let's read this. So obviously all the women except the slavers, blah, 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 the king, emperor, Tambut, ruling vast dominions that yield him inexhaustible treasures, piles of gold, 1,300 pounds of weight. Many merchants of Fez, Morocco, and Grand Carré resort to Tambut for the trade of gold, which was brought thither by the people of Mandinga in so great abundance that oftentimes the merchants, having disposed of all their commodities which they barter with them for that metal. So in other words, they take a whole bunch of stuff, not ingots, not cowrie shells, not some stupid stuff like that. They take a whole bunch of things that they've brought, and they try to trade, and all of a sudden they've got a bunch of gold, which is useless in this country, right? And well, it is used as a currency, but it's kind of useless in this country. They've got a whole bunch of gold, and they've run out of provisions, they've run out of stuff. It becomes a drug, and thither left there till the next return, or else they carry it home again. So you can see that they have to, like, they try to sell a few things, but like a drug, as it says over there, they sell all their stuff, and then they're like, oh my god, I've ran out of stuff to sell, let me go home and go fetch some more stuff. Not sell cowrie shells. That is not true. That is a replacement idea. That is a lie. And these people of Mali, who did also trade in cowrie shells, so in other words, these local cowrie shells, which would be traded with other local empires, and understand that, they understood the value of those cowrie shells, but their real value obviously lay in the gold, because they traded it. And of course, Monemuji is the same, Monematapa is the same, the kingdoms of Swahili coast is the same. They understood that the foreigners loved gold more than anything else. And then finally it says, this country, according to Marmol, a prince governs, stilled emperor of Mali, who dwelling in a magnificent palace takes such state upon him that no ambassadors or envoys from foreign countries making their addresses are admitted to audience, but in posture of humble suppliance, kneeling with dejected countenance, throwing dust upon their heads. In the city Cabra, the king hath a commissary who hears, judges, and determines all causes and differences, either concerning the crown or either private arbitrations betwixt the subjects, between the subjects. So there you go. That's the real history of the golden age of Africa. Is a golden age where currency was very important. It was so important that they cared more about their internal currency than they cared about the foreign one, but they still sold foreign goods without care of what that foreign good is going to do outside, because why should they care? It's got nothing to do with them. The Arabs, contrary to popular belief, cared more about the gold in West Africa than they cared about slaves, even though there was slave carrying from that area. Also, salt is another thing they cared about. Now I could put hundreds of other cities in Africa that were very successful, but I think you get the point. So let's get back to the video with Sargon of Akkad, or Carl Benjamin, if you will.
Of course, Sam, many would argue, including lots of rather eminent historians and economists, among others, that it is
shitlibs who are coping and seething about the governmental superiority of the West.
So, of course, anyone who says this has no concept of how governments worked in Africa. Everybody just assumes that Africa is just run by a bunch of dictatorships. But as I've shown, in the Kingdom of Congo, they did not have dictatorship type rule, and in different parts they could actually remove the king from power in different, and with a system, not by like a coup or something. In different parts, power was administrated like through different clans, and so there was equal power, a sort of democracy, and in some cases you had a straight up democracy.
Like, it's not an accident that we produce good governance. This is a product of our history. It's not an accident that other countries around the world don't produce good governance. It's a product of their history too.
So, of course, they sit here with this lie that they are the only ones that produce good governments, which, of course, it's questionable how good some of these governments really are, as there is always infighting and stuff like that. But we'll get back to that. And of course, how good they are, considering the fact that they exploit people on the other side of the world. Might be good for their own people, but that's just about it. Now, when looking at Africa and the kingdoms, as I mentioned, their governance inside of those regions were tolerated and made rich people and made all kinds of people, middle class, lower class, all of that, over and over again. Now, they always use slavery as an example of why those civilizations were bad, but their civilizations had slavery. So if having slavery makes your civilization bad, then their civilization had to be bad.
Colonization and European colonization that was at least a significant part of the contemporary political problems of many of the states that you were talking about.
Yeah, the fact that we gave it up.
So Africa is a pretty big continent, and I don't even know where to start with this one. Like, where should I get the information from? Because there's so many countries to start with. Let's start with South Africa, for example. Basically, land rights and basically any rights really was stripped away from the black people under the British Empire, and mass poverty began for these people who had once belonged to kingdoms who, even if they were not the same as Europeans, they could at least eat. Because of this, they eventually just became mules of the European society, digging gold and stuff like that for them for nothing.
Like, I mean, maybe not for like West Africa with France, but for the rest of Africa, the fact that we left is their problem. And all sorts of terrible things sort of started happening. All just dictatorships started springing up everywhere after the retreat of the British. And we are just like, well, somehow this is our fault. It's like,
so in case you guys don't know, this is a complete rewrite of history. There really were no democracies under the British and under any of these people. What really happened was they were dictatorships. There's more democracies now in Africa than there was back then. So I don't know what the hell he's talking about. But you can see, of course, that in Africa, there's democracies, and then which are considered full democracies. I don't know. This map is sort of biased a little bit, but there's countries which are considered full democracy. I don't know why the United States is in there. It's not a full democracy, but there's some that are full democracies. There's some that are open anocracy. Now, anocracy is a mixture of democracy and an autocracy, but we don't need to get deep into that. And you can see there that there are almost no autocracies in Africa, but failed occupied there, and democracies, and the brown resembles closed anocracies, meaning that leaders are probably not going to change hands.
well, yeah, I guess inventing these kind of state technologies, these, on the sort of tech tree, and then leaving without the infrastructure and the cultural knowledge on how to use these things. I mean, this was one of the things that Ian Smith kept saying.
By the way, you know what's stupid about what he just said is he said without the cultural knowledge of how to use these things. Why didn't they have the cultural knowledge on how to use those things? If what he's saying is true, it's because they were not using them. So the majority of the populations were not using state stuff because they were designed for a small elite. Do you not understand that you're destroying your own point? And basically the main point here is Europe ruined Africa, a place where it had better governance before they came. And then after they came, they, of course, brought more and more corruption. And I promise you, if we were to ever get good again, if we did it in the next 10 years, but we decided to do something like what South Africa does right now, which is to go independent and come up with our own ideas, they're going to come with guns and stuff. They're going to come get us.
Before the abandonment of Rhodesia to become Zimbabwe under warlord Mugabe.
So although Rhodesia, right, preceded the modern day Zimbabwe, there was another Zimbabwe before that, but if we just take those two, that Rhodesia was basically Slavers Bay for black people. In other words, black people living in that area were basically impoverished and had nothing going for them. The first ever democracy for the black people, there was democracy for the white people, but the first ever democracy for the black people, led them to vote for ZANU PF and stuff like that, that led to Robert Mugabe becoming the demon that he was. But again, that was not a consequence of the people, but a weakened world. But we'll get back to that. This idea that like Robert Mugabe resembles all nations is ridiculous. I mean, South Africa is just South, and its democracy is working.
He was like, look, I'm happy with the Africans having the vote, but they have to be educated, property-owning Africans, so they understand what the vote means and why you shouldn't just vote yourself socialism and Gibbs. And obviously he lost the argument for some reason.
So for those of you that don't know, Ian Smith is this evil bastard who basically spent most of his time trying to stall the Africans while continually trying to promise them democracy in the future, and then going back to white people saying we're never going to do that. But then he would go do this double speak where in private he would go tell white people that we're never going to do it. In public, he'd go and tell the black Africans that, hey, it's only a matter of time. And then when it became obvious to the Africans that democracy was never going to come, then they had to do it through violence. And then when he was pressured, democracy was set up and they lost. And then, of course, the white people got pissed, ran away from Zimbabwe, and yeah.
And then hyperinflation, civil war, barbaric, brutal takeover, people being persecuted, things went to shit.
So firstly, a civil war, one of the greater civil wars, was already existing in Rhodesia. And you may be looking here and saying, oh, soldiers withstanding with a white guy. Most of these soldiers reported being, basically they were under stress, and a lot of them would betray this group and go and be with the other people. Now, the war that was fought was called the white people called it the Zimbabwe Bush War. The Zimbabweans called it the War for Independence, because of course they were freeing themselves from white people. And basically what happened is there was a war, and the war was white rule versus everyone gets democracy. That's what he's complaining about. That black people said, they didn't say, hey, we want democracy and white people shouldn't be allowed to vote. They said, no, everyone should get democracy. And then happened to be that, Robert Mugabe was not the most trusted person. And if you look at the history of it, there's a longer thing of that, of him pushing people out and stuff like that. People with better intentions than he did. By the way, there were several abuses under Ian Smith of the general population, unsurprisingly. Mass racism. Bosses were known to abuse their black workers all the time, underpay them, all the stupid stuff. Even though the system that was set up was basically like the apartheid system anyway.
And so he wasn't wrong, was he? Because we assume that people, because I mean, like, to be honest with you, like, Africa was just in such an underdeveloped state at the time when we found it. It's kind of ridiculous to be like, right, okay, these guys can join a modern liberal democracy. It's like, and this.
So we've been through this before, and no, Africa was not in this super primitive state when the Europeans found them. This is not based on me. This is based on European records. And no, they were not in this super primitive state. But let's take a place that was isolated from all technology. South Africa was not isolated from all technology. In fact, we know that a lot of the technologies from Zanzibar and stuff were brought and traded from Europe. And you have many other places as well that traded with Europe and brought certain things, Europe and other countries. But one place that refused to trade was it refused integration or putting stuff in there, was Japan. It closed itself up, and Japan eventually opened itself up, even though it didn't have any of the technologies that had been built in the few hundred years of closing itself up, railways, all that other stuff. But somehow it became rich somehow. Like, what do you think happened? The answer is they didn't get colonized. And because they didn't get colonized, they had the exact same culture and they could work as a force. Now, what happened after that is they formed an empire, and then they took over certain places and they started destroying certain people. And that ended with them having a bomb dropped on them, which was something else. But now, one of the most thriving countries ever.
This was the argument that Smith had with Buckley on his show. And Buckley's like, yeah, but that's not very liberal, is it? And Smith's just like, yeah, no, I know you don't understand, but trust me, this is the only way this is going to work. And
so basically here is making excuses. So there's a YouTube, on YouTube you can find this very easily. William Buckley versus Ian Smith, the guy from Rhodesia. And he basically makes a ton of excuses. William Buckley can see right through him. And here Sagan is making excuses for a guy who basically didn't want to bring democracy to Africa.
Behold, he was correct. And now Lewis is about to make the same bloody argument. And this African guy's going, no, Ian Smith was right, and you're wrong, because you don't know what you're actually talking about.
So again, when an African person agrees with him, somehow he's like this super smart guy. But when he disagrees with him, again, we're going to go to he's a liberal, this, that, and the third.
It is the opposite.
Really?
If Africa was never colonized, where would we be?
Well, there were plenty of countries that weren't colonized. Japan wasn't colonized, and
Japan? Is Japan in Africa, Lewis?
So I want you to guess why he had to say, is Japan in Africa? What is it about Japan that is different than Africa? Africa, as you said, was not as developed as Europe by the time that the Europeans came to colonize. Japanese were not as developed because they closed themselves in as the other people. So it's analogous. It works. It turns out that even if you take this assumption that they're not as developed, then they can still go crazy with the information, with, you know, how it works. And what about Ethiopia? That place was never colonized either, but it's still suffering the same fate.
He is talking about specific people who have a specific history and had specific societies. And the guy's like, well, if it wasn't for colonization,
the only way you can believe this is if you know nothing about Africa. So let's just break it off. He says specific people. North Africans are not the same as sub-Saharan Africans, if you want to say that. But even those people, you can break them up into smaller bits. And so they're not even the same people, but yet they suffer the same fate. So what do you mean they're not the same people? Like, why is Egypt in the state that it's in? Why is Libya a failed state? Why is Tunisia and all these other places, why are they what they are today? Why is Ethiopia, Somalia, all of these places that are very different from one another, they didn't have the same rule, they didn't have the same rulers, they didn't have the same level of corruption, if there was any significance in the past, but yet a giant continent. And the reason is because, of course, he's using the word African to mean black in this case, which of course is not true. It in the time when the Europeans came, there was people who were not black. And then, of course, as I showed you with that map, the Middle East also has some political problems. It's not just Africa. What do you think the Middle East and Africa have in common?
where would be? Well, they wouldn't have the railroad, would they? And they wouldn't have the states that they have, would they? Like, this guy, this is like, well, Japan wasn't colonized. Oh, well, great. Great.
I'm actually legitimately confused. Do these guys really think that if Africa was never colonized, the railway would have never made its way to Africa? Do they not know that Africans hired European architects to come and build stuff as soon as colonization was over? They brought a lot of European, Arab, all over people to come and build stuff in Africa, paid the money.
Good for them, Lewis. Somehow, the Japanese and the Africans are all just identical. There's no difference between them whatsoever.
Well, what do you mean difference? Do you mean culturally? Do you mean, because if you say culturally, then everybody in Africa has different cultures. What are you talking about? What is it that all Africans have that Japanese people don't have that makes them so separate from one another? Like, is it that one is in the continent of Africa? Is because I'll tell you, that's a very small thing in comparison.
And actually, only the clear-eyed African gentleman on this call is telling the truth, aren't they, Lewis?
And they're doing all right.
Well, they're doing all right, but not Africa.
Right. Well, there are.
They're doing all right, but they're not African. We have different problems to the Japanese. We are not the Japanese. We are different, and therefore, says the African gentleman. And
Well, first of all right is a very low term, but Africa is doing all right. What you're talking about is doing as well as Japan in the trillions and stuff like that. And again, there is a reason why Japan is allowed to have trillions.
this is just like, well, I mean, this is pretty off script. I'm not allowed to say that. I want to call him a racist. I'm desperate to call him a racist. But he's higher on the hierarchy than me when it comes to skin colours, so I can't just call him a racist. So I guess I'm just going to stumble and try and run out the clock.
Countries which were colonised that are doing well and some that weren't and aren't, I'm not sure.
Sorry to interrupt you. I'm talking from personal experience.
Yes, I mean...
I was there.
So while it's true that you can have personal experience in Africa, you can't have personal experience in every African country unless you literally like live it. Like, I'm going to live 2 years here, 2 years here, 2 years here, 2 years here. So the personal experience is still limited. And a lot of it is obviously biased by Westerners. I mean, that's why he's basically saying, I mean, the crazy claim that they need to be colonized.
Something Lewis does not have. Doesn't know anything about this, but he's got his liberal priors.
When the British were there.
I mean, America quite literally had a colony in the United States, in Africa, called Liberia, which has had plenty of problems. So I'm...
Was Liberia a colony of America?
Not only was Liberia a colony of America, it was also an experiment of America, and America could not leave it alone for a long time. Charles Taylor, one of the worst dictators to ever occur in the world, also came from America. So yeah, they did some stuff, which, by the way, Charles Taylor is rumored to have been let out of prison by the FBI so he could go and take over Liberia.
Did America administer Liberia? As far as I watched a video about Liberia a while ago. Basically, the Americans sent back blacks upon emancipation, and they set up a hierarchical society where they oppressed the people who were living in that area and set themselves up as a ruling class.
Well, so it's not that simple. And again, I have to get quotes here, so I'm not going to do it today, but we're going to talk about Liberia and how America basically set it up to fail from the beginning.
Even then, are we using Liberia as the example of colonization bad? Like, we could use Rhodesia or South Africa or wherever to be like, oh, look, these countries did quite well. What's the problem?
If a few people making a lot of money and then everybody else dying or starving to death is doing quite well, then yes, the colonies did do quite well. But then my question would be, what problem then do you have of Africa now? Because it's the same situation. The rich are well fed, and then the poor is different.
Necessarily sure that recolonization will do terribly well.
What has happened since the American and the British left Africa? In chaos.
Right. Okay.
He's just laugh. That's such. I love the defeated and the defeated tone. Let's listen to that again.
So of course, you know, he does this thing of like Africa's in chaos, but again, some people have seen how Africa has been like in the recent videos that people have been seeing, which this video is going back maybe 2 decades in on YouTube, which you can see and watch Africa and realize that it's not this chaotic place that people like to pretend that it is. But that's something else.
Has had plenty of problems, so I'm not necessarily sure that recolonization will do terribly well.
What has happened since the American and the British left Africa? In chaos.
Right, okay.
Just because I wasn't going to say no, everything's going great in Africa. What are you talking about? Since decolonization, and the African guys I know, I live there. I lived under the British, and I lived there since. I'm telling you, it's chaos, and actually, we'd prefer it if you come and bring order again.
You know what's funny? We actually have plenty of examples. What happens when you bring the West into non-Western countries, like some of the countries that they consider scary and weird and wrong, like Venezuela and whatever. All of these countries had Western influence. What is it? Okay, so what is it about South America that makes it so similar to Africa that it suffered the same history? What is it about the Middle East that made them suffer the same history as well? That after colonization, there's dictators, there's all this other stuff. You're telling me that Europeans are one unique race of people, and then everybody else is just exactly the same, except the Japanese?
And Lewis is just completely deflated. Oh, okay. Well, I mean, where am I going to go with this? Like, where am I going to go with it? Normally, I'm the one, like, normally I'm the one attacking other white people on this. I can't just attack the Africans as well. I can't remember.
I wonder what's in the last 30 seconds that he's not playing. But this guy basically gave great arguments back at this guy. So much so that this African guy who called had to like hop to different topics. When the guy said they need to be colonized, the guy mentioned that the colonization ruined Africa. And then he had to hop to a different thing, right? And when he hops to a different thing, it mentions Japan. He has to hop away from Japan and start going back to Africa and say there's chaos. So the guy destroyed him, but Sagan sees it a completely different way.
Well, Sam, it's a view. And
it's a view. But anyway, I love that people are kind of reversing the meme. Allow me to explain your country's identity and how it includes me.
That would be funny if that's not what the right was literally saying. Like they're going to explain Africa to Africans. Also, you just promoted not only explaining it, but the takeover of Africa.